Rich, thank you very much. And let me begin by saying thank you very much to Georgina for such a lovely welcome to country. And I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders, past and present, and even elders here today. And thank you, Rich. I would like to just say that I always find that being part of this sector and being allowed to contribute to this sector a great privilege, and that I enjoy enormously arriving at events like this and finding whole groups of new faces as well as people who have been working tirelessly in this area for many, many years. As Deb was saying, when I arrived, she said, oh God, it's just a bit like a wedding, isn't it? Meeting all your old, all your old families, all here from different parts of it. It is the coming together for events like this that we do create the networks that actually potentially make a difference to the sector. So my understanding for today is that my role is just to provide an overview of the issues which are galvanising us in Victoria at the moment, and I guess a bit of a picture about how we got to where we are. So a little bit of history, a little bit of context. We're really looking forward enormously to hearing Vari about the well-developed work in Scotland. So it's with much anticipation we look forward to hearing from you, Vari, because a lot of people have heard from me before. Not that there's any pressure. I've taken the title of this presentation to be High Risk to Family Violence Intervention. As a small play on words, I wanted to focus on the issues which constitute high family violence risks interventions, but I also didn't want to shy away from just mentioning some of the potential unintended consequences of developing a more substantial infrastructure for responding to high-risk cases. Sorry, I just need to... Okay, so just to give you a little overview of what I plan to do, a bit on Victorian context, some of which has already been discussed. Then just talking about some of the risky issues which have had to be addressed in developing the high-risk model or the RAMP for Victoria. And so there's been a group of people that have been meeting in a very collaborative process for some time, and I think that it's good to have the department being so collaborative in this process, where many people from both academia and community sector organisations have worked with government to think through some of the issues about the model. And so I'm just going to raise a few of the issues that have been thought about and discussed as part of this. And I guess to finish then with some cautionary notes about the high risk focus. So as we've been hearing, and everyone has sought to mention this so far, and I'm continuing to do that we have been having in Victoria some very prominent and tragic child deaths. Darcy Freeman, aged 4, Jai Bailey and Tyler Farquharson in 2005, Luke Batty, Savannah and Indiana in 2014, as well as, there are a number of children also who have died in the last year, 8 children. The latest data that was given to us from Victoria Police, 8 children in Victoria killed in the past year in the context of family violence. And as was mentioned, we had another 5 deaths in Victoria yesterday. So I just think that there's I know that we keep on mentioning these issues, but it does seem to me that we're seeing in this context also some very serious issues around these children. Many of these children were part of revenge killings, aimed not at the child, but taking from the woman the most precious people in her life. The intent is the woman's lifelong sadness and pain, and the children are almost collateral damage in this particular war zone. It's a particularly horrific form of violence against women and their children. And we've also just been hearing too about the way in which homicide is being recalculated, and domestic homicide is being recalculated in Victoria. I remember being at Mornington Peninsula where I was giving a talk, and they just had the newspaper article which said that 2011 to 2012, 13 arrests for domestic violence. In 2012 to 13, 45 arrests for domestic violence related deaths. Now, that was just kind of extraordinary. You know, this is really why we're here. But in fact, if we're looking at this number of murders, we're looking at something that's extremely, you know, where we need to be doing something different. We need to be taking action in a different way, in a crisis, in a much more crisis-driven way, in a much more focused way. Many of those 45 deaths, as I understand it from the article, were around manslaughter, culpable driving, incitement to murder, and that 25 were clear domestic murders. And there was also 579 rapes in the context of family violence last year. So in a population with less than 6 million people in Victoria, women will be killed at a very disturbing rate, which seems as high as anywhere in the world. Now, some of this could be to do with some very good forensics that were done by Victorian Police, where instead of just taking the data as such, you know, as reported, they went into the case notes and actually could see that there was a lot more murder that was happening in domestic violence related than had previously been thought. So some of this is about very good work, I think, from Victoria Police, looking at case notes rather than just looking at the reported data. Nevertheless, it remains a highly disturbing figure. I do wonder whether there's not some contagion effect. So this is just a hypothetical idea, and I haven't seen it put around much. But you know, with suicide, what you see is patterns that occur where you get a contagion effect, where one suicide actually leads to more. And I do wonder whether there's a group of very disaffected men who are being emboldened by the notion that this is now a possibility. This is what you do when you're unhappy and disaffected and angry. And that they are creating their own discourse about a sense of entitlement and a sense of wiping out their own families as a response to their own sort of unhappiness and disaffection. So I think it's an extraordinarily worrying trend, and I think it's extremely difficult to know what the best response is in terms of prevention of these fatalities and deaths. I also think that we've all mentioned the increasing rates. So not only do we have the fatalities, but we also actually have a very high rate of reporting now of domestic violence. Again, this may be very strongly representative of a much greater confidence in the system. And it may also be that we've widened the definition of family violence, but we're also looking at very high numbers of crisis calls to both the police and to the women's violence crisis service. At the same time, we're also seeing very worrying rates of men breaching intervention orders. 820 men breaching more than 3 times, 200 men more than 5 times. And that's the formal reporting. It doesn't talk about the numbers of women that are putting up with enormous levels of harassment and stalking. So just moving on to a little bit of history, because that is part of the history of why we've got to where we are. But we've also had quite, you know, for the last 8 years or so, ever since I've been back in Victoria, there have been, which was in 2006, there's been many visits from UK police members discussing homicide and also crimes of dishonour. We've had statewide forums addressing high risk since about 2008. We've also had the influence, I think, of UK practitioners bringing news about their experience of marriage. So people like Deb Nicholson and Erin Davies, who came from elsewhere, having worked and seen how useful and important the high-risk response can be. And so I think that we've been galvanised in our own way to take this forward. We've also had, I think, a greater awareness of how important it is to share the issues around information sharing, because one organisation doesn't hold all the information about the levels of risk that women are experiencing. If you look at back at 2008 when KPMG did some benchmarking data about the numbers of violence incidents, domestic violence incidents that were being reported, they showed, when they looked at the police data, 2% of 886 incidents of police identified 6 or more risk factors present for when they at domestic violence incidents when they did their risk assessment. At the same time, and so in the same time period, the NCARS data from the North and also the data from the Women's Family Violence Specialist Services found that around 34% of women had 9 or more risk factors. So at some level that's to be expected, that you don't see the level of risk until you actually have trusted conversations with the woman, not at the point of crisis. It also might be that given the level of training that's occurred with the police over the since 2008, that you might also get police picking up and identifying a lot more risk at family violence incidents. But it's very clear that the women's services are picking up a huge amount more understanding and identification of the risks than you get from a police incident, than police attendants at an incident. So hence the huge importance of sharing information, because actually we've got very different sources of that information and very different different amounts of knowledge about the level of risk that could be occurring. So we've also had the demonstration models that were already mentioned by Sylvia, and where one was in Geelong, one was in Heidelberg. They were given a very positive evaluation by Thompson and Woodall. I think that one of the things that the evaluation raised was how difficult it is to establish a very effective high-risk response. It didn't just happen with an announcement. There was an enormous amount of process that occurred behind trying to get agencies to work well together, to share information and to act to bring down the risk. We've had the announcement of $30 million for family violence intervention by this government, of which some of that will go to supporting 17 ramps being rolled out across Victoria. This is a huge program. It's extraordinarily exciting to think that we are going to be moving forward in this way. And I guess, that it's been on the cards for the last 6 or 7 years. And so to actually be bringing it forward feels like an enormous opportunity. So in terms of some issues, so moving out of the context to some of the issues that have been discussed, because I know that many of you in this room haven't been part of these sort of detailed discussions that have been happening. And many of you would have some queries and questions about the process. Because it's not obvious the way what becomes in and what becomes out when you're looking at the high-risk model. So the CRUF is the foundation for family violence risk assessment in Victoria and will remain so. And I think that a foundation has been established there, and it's a foundation for getting a shared understanding and a shared language for thinking about family violence together. At the same time, there are a wide range of actuarial tools which would weight some of those risk factors, and they've been validated measures and validated tools. There is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the use of actuarial tools in conjunction with professional judgment and clinical judgment does create more consistency and greater accuracy. Now, there's been no appetite in Victoria for the use of actuarial tools, and we're not going forward with those actuarial tools at this point. I know that the HRRC, that Sergeant Spriggs will be talking about, does use an actuarial tool. That's not necessarily a validated one, but it's based around the L17. But my understanding, though, is that it isn't the prime decision-making tool in relation to what goes to the high-risk forum, but probably he could say more about that. I simply raise this issue, not because I'm unhappy about the fact that we're not using actuarial tools. I think it's been totally agreed, and that's really important. I feel very clear about that. but I just think it's something we should keep on the agenda. In the 2 demonstration sites, it took a long time for them to agree what actually was high risk and what was going to go to the panel. And with 17, where we know across Victoria we've got some excellent interagency working, and we've also got some fairly difficult interagency working. So that it may be, I just think it's an issue that we should remain and consider and keep under review, because it's not easy to decide what should come to the risk levels, and it's not always easily agreed. There's certainly, under the model that's being developed, there'll be quite a lot of guidance and quite detailed guidance. So maybe that will make all the difference, and so I think that will be helpful to see how that plays out. A central discussion for the group was also thinking about women's representation, because there is a lot of ambivalence about talking about women without them being present. And I think that our baseline has always been that when you're doing risk assessment, when you're doing risk planning, when you're doing risk management, that you should always do that with the women involved. However, when you're looking at the most high risk, there are very high risks for them to be involved in this process. It may put them at greater danger. Particularly if she's living at home with the offender, and some of these women are, then it can be extremely difficult for them to attend something like a high-risk panel without putting them at increased danger. I think, though, that the lack of women's presence at the forum does raise a whole lot of issues about the way in which we look to good practice in this area, which means, that the briefings from the woman are really important. How we represent her at the forum is incredibly important. The perpetrator focus becomes more important rather than less important. What we know from the Marrocks in England is those that work well have a perpetrator focus. Those that don't work well and become ones which are really about mother blaming and woman blaming are ones that we want to avoid. And you will avoid it by creating and continuing to focus in very strict ways on these being forums for perpetrators, to look at how we manage the accountability and the response to the perpetrator. And I guess the issues of confidentiality are also incredibly important in these forums. I guess some other issues that arise are around the child protection issues, because clearly there'll be many children that are coming as part of the family into these forums. And we do know that as the severity of risk to women increases, so does it to their children. There are no formal actuarial tools around family violence for children, and that's because the issues of risk assessment in this area for children are too complex at this point to be really managed very well within an actuarial tool. But we do know that severity for women also increases severity for children. I think that one of the issues about the ramps is that this is a major opportunity for child protection. Because one of the areas where child protection is consistently weak, and not just here in Victoria but everywhere, has been in having a focus on men, and particularly men who are violent. It's not their core business. They're not well trained in this area. Certainly there's been a rollout of training over the last 6 months, which has been very important. But when you're looking at high-risk offenders, actually you're really looking at policing responses. You're really looking at how child protection works with the police, not how child protection works alone. And these high-risk forums, I think, are going to be really important for actually capacity building the family violence practice within the child protection area. So I think that they're an opportunity. I also think that in the area of post-separation violence, child protection has actually only a limited role. You've got a protective parent. taking protective parents through standard child protection investigations is actually not necessarily what's required unless they have a perpetrator focus. That actually a lot of post-separation violence is much better dealt with through a ramp, where you're really trying to take on the issues around the offender's violence, stalking and harassment, and that's a much more appropriate venue than actually the child protection processes, unless child protection creates a different form of intervention in the post-separation arena. And again, that's wide open for them to be doing some different forms of practice in this area. But really what we have when you've got post-separation violence, you've got a protective parent and one who needs greater support and help in that protection. And that's the role of the interagency in this area. But just following on the post-separation violence things, it's a bit unclear from the many police family violence, how many police family violence incidents involve post-separation violence. What we know from some of the work in the UK is that 40% of police referrals to child protection in the UK involve post-separation violence. In November we'll have Nikki Stanley, who was very involved in that work and leading that work. She'll be coming to speak with us in November. So just to put a little flag there, because she was interested in just how much of what went to child protection was post-separation and post-separation violence. And I do think it raises a lot of issues about the role of the ramps in relation to family law. Because when you're looking at post-separation violence, you're mainly looking at child contact issues and inappropriate contact for men who are violent and who are continuing that violence and harassment. So I would have thought that, how we give the documentation to the woman to ensure that in any mediation processes, any dispute resolution processes, any family law, legal proceedings, it's known that the Family Violence Interagency has deemed this man as a high-risk offender. So I think that's going to be a very important role for the ramps. It's not just about formal family law proceedings, because we do know that 90% of family law proceedings are paralegal. Most cases are not going into family law, into the courts. They're related in other processes. So I think the woman is going to need this information if she's in the post-separation space. But I think it's a bit of a challenge about how we make sure that evidence is there for her and it's part of the safety plan. I guess another issue is, what about the men? Usually, I don't expect it so much in this forum, but in a range of other forums, you can never speak without someone standing up and saying, what about the men? So I'm just putting it out there. That I actually think what about the men is an important issue for our thinking about the ramps. At the moment, we've pretty much written this in a totally gendered way to say that the women and children are the victims and the man is the perpetrator. There's actually, in the barracks in the UK, most of them would have some of them have no men who ever come to the barrack, but some of them do have a few men that come to the barrack. I don't think that we should count them out. We'd be interested to hear from Barry about this issue, about how that's managed. But I also noticed in looking at the evaluations of the Cardiff Marrick and the DIN project, that they said that some of their most high-risk cases were where you had both a man and a woman where there was violence. And so I don't think that we should, and so both of them were named and came to the marriage. So I think that we should be careful about just not writing out the issues around the homicides and the fatalities and some of the severity of violence in this area from women, because there's a group of women who in self-defence are also murdering or manslaughter. And certainly in some parts of the states, they've brought down their domestic homicide figures by making women safer. And in fact, it just means that fewer women are killing in self-defence. But that is nevertheless a very important strategy that I think we should keep in mind in relation to our lands. Let's just find the issue around risk management. I think that having some agreed risk management procedures are really important. That we often have some good sort of ideas about case management, for women's safety, but thinking about what do we need for the focus on the perpetrator. Clearly, there's information sharing. Clearly, intervention orders and charging of offenders is really important. But things like we actually must demand really high evidence gathering, high crime scene evidence gathering, photos, witness statements, permission for medical information, follow-up of the perpetrator who leaves the scene, intelligence information about other crimes, action on breaches, following up on warrants, every effort to apprehend. And making that really clear that that's an expectation of interagency and its expectation of the justice system in this process. So just a note of caution, to finish on the note of caution really, what about the 90% of other women? Actually only 10% roughly of women come before a ramp, or will come before a ramp. And what we know is that there are many high-risk women and their children who don't show up as high risk. You know, if you look at, say, Farquharson, if you look at Freeman, they wouldn't necessarily have been coming before a ramp. You know, there were issues there that were worrying, but actually they wouldn't have ramped up to be in that 10%. So ignoring the other 90% is, in fact, we must keep it on the agenda that we've got to be responding to women and their children who are not designated into the high-risk ramp, and how we keep, you know, an intervention that actually provides equal attention to them as well, I think will be one of the challenges, and one of the most important challenges, as I guess we try and once we get the RAMs up and running, that's going to take a huge amount of energy from an already overstretched sector. So I think that we just have to keep an eye on that. It's incredibly important. I think the notion that the ramp is not a silver bullet, got a one step and an integrated family violence response. What we do know, though, is that in the areas where you have highly effective ramps or barracks, you get a ripple effect of better practice rippling out, that they provide the foundation in a stronger way for how we should be responding everywhere, not just in the high-risk cases. And if you notice, there's issues around diverse communities. Have we really got the Aboriginal community behind ramps? You know, have we really engaged with the Aboriginal community to say this is our high-risk response for the women in your communities and for the men in your communities and for the children in your communities? Have we really engaged some of our core communities with the notion of the risk response? Because actually we need to have them on board in ways that make it feel like they own the process as well as the mainstream. Yeah. And that part of the notion, you know, I guess of not overemphasising the ramp as the only response is that there were 14 key steps in the Stop the Deaths campaign. And we need to look to a whole range of issues in the way in which we respond to domestic and family violence. And so just to finish, that in terms of managing high risk, they're an enormous opportunity for the family violence sector. And I think that, you know, we would be very pleased to think of them as a way forward. And I think that there would be general agreement and excitement about this next step in our intervention. And particularly in the way in which it galvanises the interagency to work together. I guess my thought is that our memorial to Luke Batty and all the other women and children in Victoria who have died is to create a stronger and safer intervention for those that live with violence.